The contractions had been coming every 4 minutes for the last hour, and Kael'Mira still refused to sit down. She stood at the cracked porthole of the shuttle, one hand pressed flat against the cold plasteel, watching the storm system below spiral across the continent's spine like a wound that wouldn't close. Her other hand rested on her belly, not cradling, not soothing, just resting, the way you might lay a palm against a wall to steady yourself in the dark. "You need to sit," her husband said. Davin's voice was the careful voice, the one he used when he was frightened and trying not to show it. "I need to get home," she said. Behind them both, their pilot, Ren, was doing something with the navigation console that involved a great deal of quiet swearing. The shuttle was a rented civilian craft, mid-range, built for clear skies and short hops between colony platforms. It was not built for the kind of electromagnetic interference now pressing against them from every direction, thick and directionless as wool. "Storm's not on any chart," Ren said, not for the first time. "Whatever this is, it came up in the last 20 minutes. I'm going to have to put her down." Kael'Mira turned from the porthole. "How far are we from the nearest registered settlement?" "That's the problem." Ren pulled up a display that showed a broad green sweep of uninhabited forest plateau. Then he pointed to a single light on the edge of the scan. "Something's down there, about 11 kilometers northeast. It reads like a town, population signal, power grid structures, but it's not on any chart I've got." A contraction moved through her then. She felt it the way she felt all of them, not as pain exactly, but as the body asserting something enormous, the way a river asserts itself against a dam. She breathed through it, slow and even, and neither man spoke until it was done. "Put us down," she said. They landed in a field at the edge of the town. The first thing Kael'Mira noticed was the silence, not quiet silence, no wind, no insect noise. The trees at the field's border stood perfectly still, every leaf locked in place as if painted there. The sky above was a color she didn't have a name for, not quite gray, not quite amber, a color that looked like it had been mixed by someone who had only seen descriptions of sky and never the sky itself. Davin helped her out of the shuttle. The grass under her boots was dry. Ren came last, carrying the emergency medical kit and looking at everything with the expression of a man cataloging problems. "Someone will have a communicator," he said. "We can call for evac." They walked toward the town. The buildings were wrong. That was the only word for it, wrong. Not dilapidated, not bombed out, not primitive. Wrong in a stranger way, the way a dream is wrong. A tall glass-fronted building in a style from the old colonies, standing directly against a low stone structure that could have come from Earth's medieval centuries, which sat beside a prefabricated medical unit of obvious contemporary manufacture, all three pressed together with no alley between them, no transitional architecture, no logic. As if someone had assembled the idea of a town without quite understanding how towns worked. The people were moving. This was what stopped Davin mid-step. He put a hand on Kael'Mira's arm, and they stood at the town's edge and watched. There were perhaps 40 people visible on what served as a main street. They were walking, sitting on benches, standing at windows. They were dressed in a wide variety of clothing, some contemporary, some archaic, some in industrial coveralls, some in formal wear that belonged to no period Kael'Mira could readily place. They moved with the slow, glazed purposefulness of people deep in a waking dream. One woman walked the length of a block and then turned and walked it again. A man at a bench opened a book, stared at it for several seconds, closed it, opened it. Two children walked in a tight circle around a fountain that had no water in it, holding hands, not speaking. Nobody looked at them. "Hello," Ren called out. The man with the book looked up. His eyes moved over Ren with no recognition, no curiosity, no alarm. Then he looked back at the book. "We need medical assistance," Davin said, loudly and clearly. "My wife is in labor. Can anyone point us to a clinic?" The woman who kept walking the same block walked past them. Her eyes were open. Her face was expressionless. She turned at the corner and came back. Kael'Mira looked at Davin. He looked at her. "Medical unit," she said, pointing. "The prefab one, let's check it ourselves." Inside the medical unit they found equipment that worked, supplies that were stocked, and a nurse who smiled at Kael'Mira with warm, empty eyes and said, "Of course. Right this way. Everything is provided." She said it in a flat, pleasant tone, like someone reciting a phrase they had been taught but not told the meaning of. She led Kael'Mira to a clean room with a functional examination table, and proceeded to assist in the delivery with mechanical competence and absolute silence. The baby was born 40 minutes later. A girl. Small, fierce, astonishingly loud for someone who had existed for less than an hour. She screamed at the strange light coming through the window, screamed at the too still air, screamed at the nurse's smooth and featureless smile, and Kael'Mira held her against her chest and thought, "Yes, that's right, scream." She named her Vera. By the time Davin returned from trying to find a communicator, the color had drained from his face in a way that had nothing to do with the birth. "The shuttle's gone," he said. Kael'Mira looked at him. "I walked back to the field. It's just gone. Not crashed, not moved, gone, like it was never there." Ren, standing in the doorway, said nothing for a long moment. Then, "I found the edge of the town." "How far?" Kael'Mira asked. "About 800 meters in any direction." He paused. "There's a wall." She had expected something visible. A force barrier, a fence, some alien construction that announced itself. What Ren led them to, the following morning when Kael'Mira was on her feet again, slower than she wanted to be, but upright, Vera in a carrier against her chest, was nothing so dramatic. It was a surface. Invisible but solid, smooth under the hand as polished glass, faintly warm. It curved. That was what told you it wasn't a wall but a dome. Run your hand along it and the curve was unmistakable, rising away from you in all directions. A perfect sphere of nothing visible imprisoning everything within. Davin put both palms flat against it and pushed. He didn't say anything. He just pushed, and his face said everything about how much it didn't move. "Zoo," Ren said quietly, "we're specimens." Kael'Mira was looking at the dome. She pressed one finger against it. The surface neither gave nor resisted, it simply existed, the way mathematics simply exists. Immovable not because of force but because of category. You couldn't argue with it any more than you could argue with an equation. "Who built it?" Davin said. "I don't know," said Ren, "but I'm going to find out." What followed was not a quick revelation. This was important. Kael'Mira understood it later, looking back, that one of the things the situation required of them was time. The instinct was to sprint, to panic, to demand answers from a universe that was withholding them. But panic consumed the very fuel they needed for thinking, and so she made herself move at a different pace. She catalogued. She observed. She kept Vera fed and warm and alive, and while she did, she thought. She was, by profession, a systems analyst. She had spent 11 years working for a mid-tier colonial infrastructure firm, auditing the mechanical and procedural health of settlements that were too small to afford full engineering teams. She found things that didn't work. She asked the right questions in the right order and followed the logic wherever it went, even when it went somewhere inconvenient. She had never, in 11 years, encountered a system she couldn't eventually understand at some functional level. Every system had rules. Rules could be mapped. Mapped things could be navigated. She told herself this on the second night, lying on a cot in the medical unit with Vera asleep on her chest, and Davin's breathing steady in the next cot over, and the town outside doing its patient, unending repetition. She told herself, this is a system. Design things, obey rules. Find the rules. On the fourth day, she started keeping notes. She had no writing instruments. The medical unit had a stylus for the records terminal, and she borrowed it and found a section of the unit's supply manifest printed on paper stock, the reverse side blank, and she began to write down what she observed. Not in any scientific format, just observations. The woman who walked the block, 7-minute cycle, never varies, always the same block. The children at the fountain, 4-minute cycle. The man with the book, 17 minutes. The nurse, no visible loop, but she had a repertoire. She would perform her welcome routine, administer care, then sit until needed. The repertoire repeated but wasn't time fixed. She wrote, loops are triggered by context, not by clock. The nurse responds to stimuli, the others do not. This suggests different conditioning levels, some specimens more deeply processed than others. She wrote, how long have the deepest ones been here? She wrote, specimens from different eras of human history, judging by clothing and architecture. This has been running for a long time. Davin read over her shoulder one afternoon. He said, what are you doing? Figuring out the rules. You think there are rules? There are always rules. He was quiet for a moment. He had a quality she'd always valued in him. He didn't argue when he couldn't improve on what you'd said. He just accepted it and moved on. He pulled up a section of blank space on her notes paper and wrote, what are we to them? She thought about it. Then she wrote, zoo specimens is the obvious answer. But zoo specimens aren't taken away regularly. A zoo preserves its collection. Davin wrote, experiments. She wrote, maybe. But experimental conditions are usually controlled more precisely than this. The mixing of eras, the loose architecture, the fact that we've been left to wander freely for days, that's not experimental precision. She wrote, what if the condition is the experiment? What if what they're studying is what people do when they can't leave? She set the stylus down and looked at what she'd written. Outside the window, the woman walked her block. She picked up the stylus again and wrote in smaller letters, and we are the control group, the ones who haven't conditioned, the ones who are still asking questions. She underlined it twice. On the 5th day, the nurse did something unexpected. Mira was sitting with Vera in the main ward, doing the slow, patient work of keeping a newborn alive in conditions that were suboptimal for it, when the nurse came in and stood in the doorway with her usual smooth-faced expression and said, the child is well. It was not the welcome routine. It was not any of the standard care phrases. It was an observation, spontaneous and unrequested. Mira looked at her carefully. Yes, she said, she is. The nurse stood there for 3 or 4 seconds doing nothing, and in those seconds her face went through something. Not emotion exactly, more like weather passing across a terrain. A flicker. Something underneath the smooth surface that wasn't entirely gone. You're still in there, Mira said quietly. The nurse blinked. The flicker passed. She turned and went back to her chair and opened and closed her hands twice and stopped. Mira watched her for a long time. She thought, the conditioning is not absolute. There is still something underneath. Whatever the chairs did, they suppressed rather than replaced. The original person is not gone, they are buried or locked or waiting. She thought, this changes the stakes. It was one thing to escape a cage. It was another to leave 40 people in a cage that had something of themselves still alive inside it, pressing faintly against the underside of their conditioning the way a hand presses against glass. She didn't mention this to Davin or Wren, not yet. She needed to think about what it meant for their planning, needed to think about whether the plan they were building, which was still just the beginning of a plan, still more wish than architecture, could account for 40 people who couldn't be told the plan, couldn't participate in it, couldn't walk out under their own power. She needed to think about whether she was the kind of person who left them behind. The people of the town were not people, not in any complete sense. They were, she searched for a term and settled on echoes. They performed human behavior. They opened shops and closed them. They ate at tables. They exchanged fragments of conversation that looped and repeated. The man with the book opened it every 17 minutes. The woman walked her block on a 7-minute cycle. The children went around the fountain at a pace that never varied, hour after hour, until night fell and they simply stopped wherever they were, still as dolls until morning. She tried on the fourth day to interrupt a loop, not violently. She simply stepped into the path of the woman who walked the block, planting herself directly in front of her and said, "Excuse me." The woman stopped, looked at her. Her eyes were not blind, they focused, they tracked. They were just not present in the way eyes were usually present. "Where are you from?" Mira asked. The woman said, "Beautiful day." "It's not actually. There's no wind, and the sky is the wrong color." "Beautiful day." "Do you know your name?" "Beautiful day." Mira stepped aside. The woman walked on, completing her block, turning at the corner, coming back. She tried a different approach the following day with the man at the bench. She sat down beside him, said nothing, just sat. After his 17-minute cycle, he opened the book, stared at it, closed it. He did this once while she watched, twice. On the third cycle, she reached over and put her hand on the book just before he would have opened it. He stopped. His hands rested on the cover. His eyes moved to her hand. He did not speak. For 10 seconds, she counted, he simply held still in a way that was entirely different from his conditioned stillness. This was a different kind of not moving, the kind that happens when something deeper than the surface pattern is paying attention. Then he opened the book around her hand and stared at it and closed it. She took her hand away. But she filed it. She filed the 10 seconds. The 10 seconds were data. On the third day, Ren found the chamber. It was beneath the town's central square, accessed through a hatch so ordinary-looking that he'd walked past it twice. Below was a room of pale mineral walls, lit by a faint phosphorescence that had no source she could identify. Along one wall ran a series of alcoves, each containing a smooth seat of dark material. The seated shapes, chairs, thrones, benches, had the unmistakable quality of design things made with intention by a mind that understood posture and occupation, and perhaps the particular way a body receives conditioning when it is seated and still. "Don't touch them," Mira said. Ren had already touched one. They found him 3 hours later. He was walking the main street, opening and closing his right hand, not responding to his name. His eyes were open and empty as windows in an abandoned building. Davin caught him by the shoulders and shook him, gently at first and then hard, and Ren blinked slowly and said, "There were lights." And then Davin knocked him down with a clean, precise blow to the jaw, and Ren hit the ground and lay still and did not open and close his hand anymore. When he woke up, he was Ren again, shaken and angry, but Ren. "What did you see?" Mira asked. He was quiet for a moment. It was like being underwater, he said. Not drowning, not even unpleasant at first, everything slow and muffled and far away, and then it just became normal. I forgot there was anything else. He looked at his hand. "I forgot you." She filed this away. The chairs were conditioning tools. The townsfolk had been conditioned so thoroughly that the effect was permanent in them, or as near to permanent as made no difference. They could be disrupted briefly by strong enough stimulus, but the conditioning reasserted itself. By evening, the ones she'd tried speaking to sharply or startling had drifted back to their loops, their cycles, their repetitions. Whatever was running, this system had designed it carefully. On the 7th day, Mira watched something come down from the sky. It was evening, the light that amber-gray non-color deepening toward something darker that passed for night. She was sitting on the steps of the stone building with Vera asleep in her arms, and she watched it descend through the dome. The dome was permeable from above, apparently, whatever that meant for their escape, and it was not a ship. It had no visible propulsion, no geometry her mind could parse. It was a presence, a weight in the air that moved with intention. It descended to the center of the square, and she understood then that she was seeing the hand of whoever built the cage, the keeper. She thought the word, and it fit too well, and she didn't like it. One of the townspeople, the man from the bench with the book, walked forward, without hesitation, without alarm, and then he was gone and the presence was gone and the man never came back. 7 days, one person taken. This was the pattern. She told Davin and Ren. Davin sat very still. Then he said, "We have to get out before the next 7 days." "Yes," said Kael'Mira. "How?" She looked at Vera sleeping in her arms. The baby's face was scrunched in that fierce, unconscious frown that newborns wore. She had Davin's nose and something around the eyes that was entirely her own. "The dome goes down," Kael'Mira said. "We've tested the sides, we haven't tested the bottom." They spent 2 days exploring the caves. The cave system ran under the eastern quarter of the town and extended, as best they could tell, 200 meters in every direction before the rock closed in. Kael'Mira moved through it with a torch borrowed from the medical unit, mapping by hand, touching walls. Ren came with her. Davin stayed with Vera in the town, where the nurse, the empty-eyed nurse, at least posed no threat whatever she was. The first day yielded information and nothing else. The cave system was natural, formed by water, not construction, which meant it predated the dome by whatever geological time scale was relevant, which meant the dome's builders had placed their device over existing terrain and had to design around it. This was, she thought, the first useful asymmetry she'd identified. The builders had dealt with the terrain on their terms, sealing over it, not through it. Which meant the dome's geometry was the dome's geometry, and the cave's geometry was the cave's geometry, and at some point those two geometries met. Where they met was the question. She was methodical. She worked outward from the cave's center, pressing her palm against the floor every meter or so, feeling for the dome's characteristic faint warmth. Most of the floor was just rock, cool and inert. But in the deeper passages, the ones that sloped downward into the plateau's substrate, she began to feel something different. On the second day of exploration, Kael'Mira found the bottom. She was in the lowest reachable section of the cave, 20 meters below the town's surface, and she pressed her hand against the floor and felt it, that same smooth, faint warmth, that same unmovable presence. The dome extended underground. The edge of the dome here was at floor level, which meant the cage was a sphere after all, and its lowest point was somewhere beneath her. She sat back on her heels and thought about spheres, about geometry, about the difference between a wall and a curved surface. A vertical wall met the ground at 90 degrees. A sphere met the ground differently. It curved away from the ground, which meant the dome's edge at its equator was vertical, but its edge at the lowest point was effectively horizontal, which meant. She pressed her palm against the dome's underside and pushed upward. It didn't move. But when she pressed downward, into the gap between the dome's curve and the natural rock floor of the cave, when she pressed into that space, there was give, barely a millimeter, less, but it was something the wall had never offered. She held very still for a moment. She pressed again. The same result. Not movement, but the suggestion of movement. The way a truly tight door gives a fraction of a millimeter when you press it. Not opening, but acknowledging that opening is theoretically within its vocabulary. The dome was designed for a surface. The surface here was uneven cave rock. The dome's builders had not laid a foundation. They had curved the barrier down to meet the ground and trusted gravity and the dome's own rigidity to seal the gap. On flat ground, the seal would be perfect. Here, where the cave floor had its own contours, its own rises and dips, the seal was only as good as the closest contact points. And at the contact points, it was indeed perfect. But between the contact points, in the small, irregular spaces where the dome's smooth curve didn't quite reach the irregular rock floor, Kael'Mira sat in the dark of the cave for a long time, not moving, thinking. Then she put her notes paper away, stood up, and climbed back to the surface to tell the others what she'd found. Davin said, "Can we widen it?" "I don't know, maybe, with the right tools." She paused. The medical unit has bone resection equipment. That's effectively a high-frequency cutter. It won't cut the dome material. Nothing we have cuts the dome material. But if we work on the rock around the gap, we might be able to create enough space to... To what? To find out if there's anything on the other side. Ren said from the corner, where he'd been pretending to sleep, "I'll start in the morning." They worked in shifts over the next 3 days. The bone cutter's frequency was wrong for rock. It was designed for calcium structures, not mineral substrate, but Kael'Mira repurposed its field emitter to function as a crude resonance tool, not cutting but vibrating, loosening the crystalline bonds in the rock around the dome's edge. It was slow. It was maddeningly slow. The rock didn't crumble so much as granulate, and they cleared it by hand, and the gap widened by fractions of centimeters, and the air smelled of mineral dust and their own sweat. Ren worked with a kind of focused ferocity that she found simultaneously reassuring and concerning. He was compensating for the chair episode. She understood this, the specific humiliation of having lost himself, even briefly, even involuntarily, was something he was processing by working until his hands bled. She didn't tell him to slow down. The speed was useful, but she watched him. On the first day of digging, Davin came down to relieve Ren at midday and worked for 3 hours and came back up and found Kael'Mira sitting outside the cave entrance feeding Vera, with the expression of a person doing arithmetic. "You're calculating something," he said. "Always." "What this time?" She adjusted Vera's position without looking up. "Whether we should try to do something for the others before we go." Davin sat down beside her. He didn't immediately respond, which was one of the things she'd married him for, the ability to take a serious idea seriously without flinching and without rushing. "The townspeople," he said. "The conditioning wears off if the system fails. We saw that with Ren, knocking him out disrupted it. The nurse showed me something underneath her surface briefly when I spoke to her directly. The conditioning isn't absolute in all cases." She paused. "If the dome goes down or if the system powering the conditioning chambers is disrupted, they might come back, at least partially, at least enough to know they need to move. And if we destroy the conditioning chamber before we leave?" "We can't. We tried, remember when you hit the chair with the torch handle, didn't scratch it. So we can't break the chamber. We can't physically carry 40 people out through a gap that will barely fit you and Vera." He was thinking out loud, not objecting. "What can we do?" "We can make enough noise when we leave that they'll follow the disturbance. Sound travels differently at the dome's boundary. I've noticed it, the acoustics change near the gap. If there's a loud enough disruption, it might trigger a stimulus response in even the deeply conditioned ones. Get them moving in the right direction. Toward the gap. If the gap is big enough by then." He looked at her. "Is it going to be?" She looked at Vera. "I'm going to make it big enough." On the second day of digging, Davin paused, sat back and said, "It's thinking about us." Kael'Mira looked up. "The keeper, or whatever it is, it knows we're here. It knows we're different from the others." He wasn't panicking. His voice was observational, like a man describing weather. "We've been here over a week and we haven't conditioned. We're interfering with its patterns. Asking the townspeople questions, going into the cave system, now digging. Something that runs a system like this doesn't ignore anomalies." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't. So we have less time than we think." She went back to work. On the evening of the third day of digging, the sky darkened differently. Kael'Mira was above ground feeding Vera, sitting on the steps where she'd watched the keeper descend before. She felt it before she saw it, a pressure change, a quality of attention in the air, the specific sensation of being looked at by something very large. She didn't move. She held Vera against her chest and looked up. The keeper came down. It was larger this time, or she was closer or she was less shocked and so she saw more. It had no face. It had no consistent form. It was a mass of structured intention, shapes that formed and dissolved and reformed within a general outline, the way a murmuration of birds makes shapes in the sky without any single bird intending the shape. It descended to the square and it turned, if turning was the right word, toward her. She looked back at it. She thought, "You made this cage and put us in it, and you take us out one at a time, and you have done this to so many people for so long that you've forgotten what it looks like when the animal looks back at you." She held her daughter and she looked at it. The keeper seemed to pause, then it ascended and was gone. Nobody was taken that night. It was Wren who understood the conditioning chamber first, or not understood it exactly, but found a way to use it. He came up from the cave the following morning with dirt on his hands, and a look on his face that was the specific look of a man who has just had an idea he isn't sure he should say out loud. "The chairs," he said, "the conditioning. It works by suppressing whatever the aliens consider the disruptive elements of human neurology, curiosity, problem-solving, resistance. It calms those down and replaces them with the loop behaviors." He paused. "What I'm thinking is the process requires the subject to be in the chair. It's not ambient. It doesn't work on us while we walk around the town because we're not sitting in the chairs." "We know this," Davin said. "What I'm also thinking is the chairs aren't just transmitters, they're receivers. They maintain a two-way connection. The town's population is connected to whatever is running this system. The keeper, or the system behind the keeper, whatever it actually is, it monitors through the chairs. The townspeople are, in a sense, sensors." A silence. "You're saying it can hear us through them," Mira said. "I'm saying it might be able to, and I'm also saying that if the receiving element works in two directions," he stopped. "I don't know. I don't have the physics. I just know that the near-death experience I had in that chair was genuinely experienced by something other than just me. I felt it notice, and then it let me go." Mira thought about this for a long time. She thought about it while she finished feeding Vera and put the baby down in the medical unit, and went back to the cave and continued work on the gap at the dome's base. She thought about it while her hands moved in the dark, and the bone cutter hummed its strange, repurposed frequency into the rock. She thought the keeper came down twice in the same week, which wasn't the pattern. The first time it took someone. The second time it came for her and then left. Something had changed in the sequence. She thought it noticed her, looking back at it, and it did not know what to do with that. She thought every system has a variable it wasn't designed to handle. The conditioning system was designed for a specific kind of human, the kind that, over days and weeks, gave in to the slow, underwater comfort of the loops. It had seen nothing else. It had no data for humans who refused, humans who looked at the cage and started examining its geometry. She thought about what Wren had said about the chairs, about two-way connections. She thought, what does a creature learn when its specimens start looking back? That night, the 11th night, she found Davin awake in the doorway of the stone building, sitting the way he sat when he was thinking hard, perfectly still, hands loose in his lap. She sat beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. The town performed its night routine, subtly different from its day routine, the loops slower, the figures moving less, some of them simply standing in place with their eyes open, waiting for morning. "We're going to make it out," she said, not a question. "I know. What's bothering you?" He was quiet for another moment. Then, "What do we tell them when we get out? When we file the report and it goes to the sector authority and they send someone back here, what do we tell them about what this is?" She thought about it. "We tell them exactly what we observed, the dome, the chairs, the conditioned population, the pattern of removal, the fact that it responded to anomaly." "And what was it? Who built it?" "We don't know. The report will say we don't know." "Yes." He looked at the street. "That's going to be the hardest part, not escaping, knowing that somewhere out there is something with enough reach to do all this, and we don't know the first thing about what it wants or how many more of these it has. She thought, he's right. That's the thing she'd been not thinking about, the shape at the edge of the problem that she'd been keeping peripheral while she focused on the geometry and the gap and the immediate solvable task. The dome was solvable. The dome's builder was not, currently, a solvable problem. One step at a time, she said. That's a very Kael'Mira answer. It's the only answer that works right now. She looked at him. We can't know what built this tonight. We can get out of it tonight. Those are not the same task, and we shouldn't try to do both at once. We get out. We report. We let people with more resources than us take the next step. He nodded slowly, and Vera. She understood what he meant. He meant, Vera was born here. Vera's first breath was inside the dome. Is that going to matter? Is that going to mean something we can't predict? Vera is healthy, she said. She was never in a chair, she was never conditioned. She's ours. She paused. She's just also someone who has a story to tell when she's old enough to tell it. Davin almost smiled. It was the almost smile she'd known for 9 years, the one that was most himself, not performing anything, just present, just him. Okay, he said. They went inside. On the 12th day they broke through. The gap had widened to perhaps 20 centimeters along a 30-centimeter arc at the base of the dome. Not a hole exactly, more a crescent of negotiated space between the dome's perfect curve and the imperfect rock of the cave floor. Kael'Mira lay flat and pressed her face to it and felt something extraordinary. Moving air. Clean air. From outside the dome. Coming through. She lay there for a moment, just breathing it. Then she sat up and looked at Ren and Davin and she said, "It's not sealed. The gap is real. We need to make it bigger." They worked for another 6 hours. The gap widened. 30 centimeters became 40, became 50. Not a tunnel, the dome's geometry made a true tunnel impossible without cutting the dome itself, which they still could not do. But a crawl space, a slot at the base of the dome's curve, possibly wide enough. Kael'Mira measured it against her shoulders, against Vera's carrier. "It'll be close," she said. "Go tonight," Davin said, "before it comes back." She went up to check on Vera. The nurse was sitting in the medical unit in her usual chair, opening and closing her hands very slightly. Vera was asleep in the portable crib they'd assembled from unit supplies. Kael'Mira stood in the doorway watching her daughter sleep, and she felt the particular weight of the moment, not fear, not courage, but something quieter and harder than either. The weight of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and knows they have a little farther to go. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the nurse. The nurse turned to look at her with that smooth, warm, empty expression. "What's your name?" Kael'Mira asked. The nurse said, "Everything is provided." "That's not your name." The nurse looked back at her hands. "Listen," Kael'Mira said. She didn't know why she was doing this. There was no tactical reason for it. They were leaving tonight and the nurse could not come. "I need you to know something because something of you is still in there and I don't know how much longer it will be before it's not." She paused. "The conditioning wears off when the system fails. I think it's going to fail soon. When it does, you'll be confused. You'll probably be frightened. I want you to go north. When you can move freely, go north. There are people outside in a settlement. They'll help you." The nurse opened and closed her hands. "North," Kael'Mira said again. "Go north." The nurse said nothing. Her face was as smooth as always, but her hands had stopped their small, repetitive motion and lay still in her lap, and she was looking at the wall in the direction that Kael'Mira happened to know faced north. It might have meant nothing. It probably meant nothing. But Kael'Mira got up and went to pick up her daughter and decided to believe it meant something. She picked Vera up. They gathered at the cave entrance an hour before dark. Davin had a makeshift pack. Ren had the torch. Kael'Mira had Vera and the bone cutter, which she wasn't putting down until they were out. They descended. The cave was dark in a way that the torch could only partially address. Kael'Mira moved by feel and memory, one hand trailing the wall, knowing the route now after 12 days of working it. The passages narrowed. The air grew colder and more mineral. Below her, she could hear Ren's breathing, steady, controlled, the breathing of a man concentrating on not being afraid. They reached the bottom. The gap was there, their gap, their 30 hours of labor pressed into the rock. It glowed faintly in the torchlight, the dome's inner surface catching light like glass. Beyond it, through the crescent opening, was darkness. Real darkness, not the amber-gray half-light of the dome's interior. Wind came through it, actual planetary wind, cold and moving and entirely absent of whatever the dome did to the air inside. Davin went first on his stomach, pulling himself through the gap. It was tight. She heard him breathing hard, heard the scrape of his shoulders on rock, heard the soft, involuntary sounds that meant discomfort, and then he was through, and she heard him stand up on the other side, and he said quietly, "It's clear, open, forest, come through." Ren went next. Easier for him, he was narrower, 20 seconds. Then it was Kael'Mira's turn. She looked at the gap. She looked at Vera, awake now, looking back at her with those dark early infant eyes that seemed to see much further than they should. "Okay," she said softly. It wasn't to Vera. It wasn't quite to herself. It was to the situation, to the moment, to the 12 days of fear and work and refusal that had brought her here, to the dome that had tried to be a permanent fact and had turned out to be merely a problem. She thought briefly about the report she'd write when this was over. She was a systems analyst. She would write a systems analysis report. She would describe the dome's architecture and the gap in the dome's geometry and the mechanism by which it was exploitable, and someone would read that report, and someone would file it somewhere, and somewhere down the line it would be useful to someone who needed it. That was all. That was enough. She lay flat on the cave floor with Vera secured against her chest, and she began to move. The gap was exactly as wide as it needed to be and no wider. The dome pressed against her back. The rock pressed against her front. Vera made a small sound of protest at being held so still, and she whispered SHH, SHH, just a little farther. Her shoulders hit resistance and she turned slightly, the way she'd practiced. She had, in the hours before descending, gone through the physical problem of the gap so many times in her mind that she knew precisely how to angle herself, knew where her left shoulder would catch and how to roll it, knew where the dome's edge would graze her spine, and that it would not injure her. It would only be uncomfortable, and that was manageable. And felt the dome's edge graze her back, and the rock floor graze her knees, and she pulled with her elbows and moved another 20 centimeters, and then another, and then she was through. She lay on the other side of the dome and breathed for 3 full seconds. The cold of the outside air was extraordinary. Not extreme cold. The night temperature was mild by any objective measure. But after 12 days of the dome's perfectly controlled interior, the slightest temperature differential felt enormous, felt like information, felt like the planet speaking directly to her nervous system in its own language. Then she stood up. Around her, trees. Real trees with real wind moving through them, leaves turning in the darkness. Above her, stars. Actual stars, unfiltered, unprismed, burning cold and clean at the top of the sky. She looked up at them and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a word for, not relief, not joy, not triumph, but something beneath all three, something older. She had last seen the stars through the porthole of the shuttle, before the storm. That felt like someone else's lifetime. The stars looked the same. "We should move," Ren said. She didn't move yet. She held her daughter under the open sky, and she looked up at those stars, and she thought about what the keeper was, what it wanted, what it had built its cage believing about the things inside it. She thought, you watched us for 12 days, and you saw what we did, and you still didn't change the cage. Because you didn't believe something our size could be a problem. You have been doing this for a very long time, and nothing has ever dug out before, and so You built your math around what you'd seen, and you forgot to leave room for what you hadn't. She thought, that's the thing about math built on incomplete data. It holds until it doesn't. Above them, at that moment, the amber-gray light of the dome shifted. It was subtle, a change in luminosity, a fluctuation in the sky that was not sky above the town. She watched it. "What is that?" Davin said. "It knows," she said. She watched the dome. Inside it, through the clear curve of the barrier, she could see the town's lights. The townspeople were still moving in their loops, their patterns unchanged, unconscious of any change in status. The children still circled the empty fountain. The woman still walked her block. Then something changed. A sound reached them, not a sound exactly, but a pressure change, a seismic something that she felt through the soles of her boots. The ground hummed. The dome's surface flickered. And then the wind came. Real wind. Not the dead, still air of the dome's interior, but a genuine planetary wind, cold and directional from the north, carrying the smell of water and distance. It hit them all at once, and Kael'Mira tilted her face up into it and felt it on her skin, and it was the single most extraordinary physical sensation she had experienced in 12 days. Inside the dome, the townspeople stopped. It was like watching a simulation pause. Every figure mid-step, mid-reach, mid-turn simply stopped, and then they looked up. All of them, every one of the 40, looked up at the dome ceiling as the wind moved through it. Because the dome was open now, or the dome was gone, she couldn't tell which. And rain was starting, actual rain, falling straight down through where the dome had been. And the townspeople stood in it, and they looked confused and young and lost. And then slowly, by ones and twos, they began to look around, and she saw on some of their faces the earliest possible version of understanding. The children stopped circling the fountain. They stood still and looked at their hands. The woman who walked the block stopped mid-stride and looked up at the rain falling on her face, and made a sound that Kael'Mira couldn't hear from this distance, but could see her mouth opening, her expression breaking open, the way ice breaks in spring, the sudden arrival of all the seasons at once. The man with the book stood up and dropped it. Kael'Mira felt something in her chest that was not what she had expected to feel. She had expected relief. She had expected victory. What she felt instead was something closer to grief, for the time they had lost, for the loops they had lived, for the versions of themselves that had been suppressed and reduced and set on repeat. She felt it for them, for all 40 of them standing in the rain, discovering that they were still people. The keeper was gone, the dome was gone, the cage was done. Kael'Mira watched through the trees for a long moment. Then she felt Davin's hand on her shoulder. "We need to get farther away," he said, gently, before morning. She nodded and turned and walked north, into the trees, into the dark, into the wind. Vera slept against her chest. The rain came lightly through the canopy above them and beat it on the baby's cheek. Kael'Mira walked and did not look back. She thought about what she would tell Vera someday, when Vera was old enough to ask. She thought about how you explained a cage to someone who had been born free inside it and carried out before they could walk. She thought about what you called what they had done, the digging, the measuring, the refusing to accept the dome as a permanent feature of reality. She thought, you don't need a name for it. You just do it. You look at what's in front of you and you find the part of it that gives, and you work at that part until you're through. The forest closed around them. The town fell behind, its amber light extinguished now, just darkness in the dark. Above, the stars burned steady and cold and indifferent, the same stars they'd watched from the porthole on the way down, the same stars that had been there when the cage was built, long before whatever alien mind had decided that small, warm-blooded creatures from the third planet of a yellow star made adequate specimens. Ren stumbled on a root and caught himself and kept walking. Davin had the torch now and held it low to see the ground. Kael'Mira's arms ached with the weight of carrying Vera, and she didn't shift her, didn't put her down, kept walking with that specific human stubbornness, that is not the opposite of exhaustion but something that exists alongside it, that refuses to yield even when every cell in the body has filed its objection. They didn't speak for a long time. The only sounds were footsteps on forest floor and the wind in the canopy, and the occasional soft sound from Vera in her carrier. It was, Mira thought, the most natural thing she had felt in 12 days, the simple, uncomplicated fact of moving through space that was not bounded, breathing air that was not recycled, hearing wind that had come from somewhere and was going somewhere else, living and indifferent and free. She was crying, she realized. Not dramatically, just the way the body sometimes releases things it has been holding without permission, quietly, incrementally, the way rock granulates under the right frequency. She didn't stop walking. She didn't wipe her face. She just let it happen and kept moving. An hour, 2 hours. The terrain changed, a slope upward, the trees thinning, the wind stronger, and then they crested something, and below them, 7 kilometers away, the lights of a real settlement spread across the dark ground like spilled stars. Davin said, "I see lights." "So do I," said Wren. Mira stood at the crest of the ridge and looked at the lights of the settlement below, and she thought about communicators, about rescue transports, about the report she would make when she got there and what she would say in it and who would believe it. She thought about the 40 people in the town behind them, newly freed, standing in the rain. She thought about whether the keeper would come back. She thought it won't, not yet, not for a while. Because we showed it something it hasn't seen before, and it needs time to adjust its understanding. That's what happens when the thing in the cage doesn't behave like a thing in a cage. The captor has to go back and rethink. And thinking takes time. And while it thinks, we run. She shifted Vera to her other arm. The baby made a small sound and settled. Below, the lights of the settlement gleamed steady in the dark. "Come on," she said, and started down the slope. They reached the settlement at dawn. The sky was going pale at the edges, the first clean light of morning touching the tops of the distant trees and working its way down. Mira walked through the settlement's perimeter sensor without stopping, and a wall panel chimed. And a security officer came out blinking and saw 3 mud-covered people and a newborn child emerging from the forest, and stood very still for a moment. "We need a communicator," Mira said. Her voice was completely steady. "Medical attention for the infant, food and water for the 3 of us, and I need to file an urgent report with sector authority. In that order." The officer stared at her. "Also," she added, "there are approximately 40 people in the forest about 7 kilometers northeast of here who will need assistance. Some of them may be disoriented. They've been through something significant." She stopped there because that was as much as could be efficiently communicated in a doorway at dawn by a woman who had been awake for most of the last 20 hours. "Please," she added, not because she needed to say it, but because it was the word you said when you were asking something from another human being who had no obligation to give it. They were taken inside. The settlement's doctor was a young man who went very quiet and professional when he saw Vera, and checked her over with the focused thoroughness of someone who understood what it meant to be an infant 12 days old, and to have spent those 12 days inside an alien containment structure, breathing recycled air. Vera bore the examination with her characteristic combination of fierce alertness and intermittent screaming. She was healthy, a little thin. Her grip reflex was strong. "She's remarkable," the doctor said. "I know," Mira said. She was given food and water and a change of clothes while Wren and Davin filed preliminary reports with the overnight duty officer. She ate without tasting. She drank 2 cups of water and a cup of something hot that might have been tea. She looked out the settlement's east-facing window at the growing light and felt the morning come in, and did not think about the dome. Did not think about the amber sky or the smooth glass wall or the chairs in their chamber below the square. She thought about the gap, the crescent of negotiated space between the dome and the rock, The thing the dome's builders had not built for, because they'd never needed to. She thought, every cage has a gap like that. Something the builder didn't account for because they'd never had to. And we are the species that finds those gaps. That's not a talent or a gift or a superpower. It's just what we do. We've been doing it since we were apes on a rock, figuring out which stones made the best edges. The keeper had built a perfect cage for the species it thought it was capturing, but it had been wrong about the species. She was still sitting at the window thinking, when the morning duty officer knocked on the door frame and said, carefully, "We sent a team to the coordinates you gave us. The people you described, they were there, all of them, they're on their way in." He paused. "Some of them don't know their names, but they're moving, they're walking. The ones who do know their names are helping the ones who don't." Kael'Mira looked at him. "Were they going north?" He blinked. "Some of them, yes. How did you?" "Good," she said, "just that good." Later that morning, when Davin was asleep on a cot and Ren was in a communication session with the sector authority investigator, Kael'Mira stood at the settlement's edge with Vera awake and watchful in her arms and looked north, back toward the plateau, back toward where the dome had been. There was nothing to see. Just forest and distance and the clean morning sky, no amber, no glass ceiling, no bounded loop of not quite sky, just the world. She looked down at her daughter. Vera looked back at her, that dark-eyed serious infant stare that seemed to be cataloging everything, storing it all in some pre-verbal archive against some future use. "I want to tell you something," Kael'Mira said quietly, "when you're old enough to hear it, about what happened to us, about the cage and what we did." Vera made a small considering sound. The cage wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing would have been believing the cage was permanent. The second they convince you the walls don't have a bottom, you stop looking for the bottom. And if you stop looking, you'll never find it. She paused. The cage was just geometry, and geometry has rules, and rules can be worked. Vera looked at her. "That's all," Kael'Mira said. "That's the whole lesson." The morning light was doing something beautiful to the tops of the trees, gold and clean, a light that didn't have an agenda. Kael'Mira held her daughter in it and felt the warmth on her face and understood, in the quiet, undramatic way that real understanding usually arrives, that they were going to be all right. Not because they'd been saved, not because someone had come for them, because they had worked the geometry. She went back inside. Behind her, to the north, in the forest and the rain, 40 people who had forgotten their own names were beginning, slowly, to remember. One by one, they were arriving at the settlement with mud on their shoes and bewilderment on their faces, and something else underneath the bewilderment, something that had been locked away and was now opening, cautiously, like a hand releasing something it had been clenching too long. They drank water that was freely given. They sat in rooms that had no conditioning chairs. They looked at each other and began the slow, difficult, essential work of becoming themselves again. The nurse was among the last to arrive. She came alone, ahead of the group that had found her, walking at the edge of the trees as if unsure of the ground. She had her hands at her sides, not opening and closing. When the settlement's officer came out to meet her, she looked at him and said, in a voice that was raw and unused and very much her own, "My name is—" She stopped, frowned, tried again. "My name is something. I'll know it again soon." The officer said, "That's okay, you've got time." She nodded and walked inside, and the morning continued, as mornings do, indifferent to the significance of what was happening in it, just light and air and the planet turning. And somewhere beyond the atmosphere, beyond the cloud layer, in whatever passed for the keeper's consciousness, something was revising its models. Something was updating its data. Something was looking at what it thought it knew about the creatures from the third planet and discovering that its sample size had been too small. Too small and too easy. The sun came up fully. The day began. Somewhere a communicator chimed and somebody answered it, Life continued as it tends to in the direction of more. Kael'Mira fed her daughter and did not look up at the sky. She had already looked. She had already seen everything she needed to see. She had seen the gap,